Chapter 13, Behavior in a Social Context. So human beings are incredibly social creatures. We spend a lot of our time in social environments interacting with people, and how we interact with them shapes how we behave, how we think, how we feel, our attitudes, everything. So in this chapter, we're going to be looking at social psychology. Social psychology is a field that looks at how we think and perceive our social world, social thinking and perception, how other people influence our behavior, and how we behave towards other people, and how that dynamic works. In this first video, we're going to be looking at part 1, social thinking and perception. First, we're looking at attribution theory, perceiving the causes of behavior, how we form and maintain impressions, and how our attitudes are formed and how they change. First, let's look at attributions. What are they? Attributions are judgments about the causes of our own and other people's behavior and outcomes. The attributions we make for other people's behavior and for our own behavior, the reasons that we mentally give for why people do things, influences our subsequent behavior and emotions. For example, if you get an A+ on a test, you can think either A, I worked really hard on that studying. I worked really hard studying for that test, and I deserved that. I worked really hard. That's an internal, right? Or you could think, wow, that must have been easy. So how you choose to perceive that, the attribution you make about the test, is going to determine or help determine your future behavior. So if you thought you did a lot of hard work and therefore earned an A+, you may be more inclined to work hard on the next test, thinking that that's why you got it. Now, if you think the test was just easy, then maybe all that studying was kind of a waste of time, and maybe you won't. It also, another one, how you react to certain situations, whether you react with understanding or you react with anger. Everyday situation, you're shopping, we'll say Walmart, you're shopping at Walmart, and somebody sort of rushes in frantically and buds in front of you. So you can attribute anything to that. You can decide, well, that person is this person is a jerk, rude, and, react with anger and give them heck. Or you could think, wow, maybe they're really stressed out and having a hard time. So I'm just going to let them go ahead of me. I'm okay, right? So you can try to understand, or you can be angry. It's all how you make attributions to that person's behavior and what their intent was. Next is Kelly's attribution theory, personal versus situational attribution. So Kelly's theory looks at, okay, so how do we decide what type of attribute, how do we decide what behavior, what are we going to label that behavior as, right? So the theory states that there are two types of attributions. One is personal attributions, which is the internal, which infers the person's behavior is caused by their characteristics. So the person in the Walmart lineup was just rude. Okay, that's a personal attribution. Or situational attribution. That infers that the person's behavior was caused by a situation, like an external. So the person in Walmart butted because maybe they're stressed out, maybe they're late for work, maybe they're trying to take care of, their elderly parents while trying to juggle their job. So it's situational factors. So what determines our response? So Kelly's theory basically says that there's 3 types of information that sort of determine which attribution. Are we going to say it's situational, or are we going to say it's personal? Are we blaming the situation, or are we going to say the person's a jerk, right? So there's consistency, distinctiveness, and consensus. So first of all, is the person's behavior consistent over time? So if the consistency, for this one, it's whether the course is boring. Okay, so let's switch to that example just for simplicity's sakes. So if Kim says that Art 391 is boring, so how are we going to do this along consistency, distinctiveness, and consensus? So consistency, if it's high, she always says it's boring. Okay. Distinctiveness, Kim says that all her classes are boring. So is it just the art one, or does she say that everything's boring? Or consensus, do other people say that it's boring? So in this situation, Kim always says that 391 is boring, but she also says that all of her classes are boring. And that's a low distinctiveness. And then consensus is low too, like other people say that it's great. So we're going to make it a personal attribution. Kim is overly critical. In another situation, if Kim says art is boring, so consistency, she always says it's boring. Distinctiveness, Kim says that only Art 391 is boring. She's very distinct with that. And then consensus, everybody says it's boring. So therefore, we're going to attribute it to a situational attribution, which is that Art 391 is actually boring. Of course, one assumption here is that people take the time to actually think about things, right? If you take the time to think, maybe this, maybe that, maybe it's personal, or maybe it's situational, then this theory fits well. But a lot of the time, often I should say, oftentimes people make snap judgments and biases. They just jump to a conclusion, and then of course this doesn't fit. Next we look at attributional biases. So biases we sort of seem to naturally have towards attributing one way or the other. The first is fundamental attribution error. Okay, so in this theory, or this concept, what it's saying is we underestimate the impact of a situation and we overestimate the impact of personal factors. So we often tend to assume that when somebody does something, or there's a situation or anything happens, we generally jump to the conclusion that it's a personal factor that did this, that led to this. One they talked about in the textbook, and my graph is on the next page. It's talking about the Fidel Castro speech, right? So they assigned the role, either they were assigned the role or it was a volunteer role, right? So if the role of being pro Fidel Castro or against Fidel Castro. So they both gave their speeches, and what they found was that whether or not the participants believed the speech giving person was assigned to the role or they chose the role, either way, they believed that a pro-Castro speech was their preference and that they were pro-Castro. So they didn't care about the situation of that they were chosen or not or assigned. They overlooked that and immediately attributed it to personal factors that that person liked and was pro-Fidel Castro. Let's go back here for a second. The interesting thing about this fundamental attribution error as well is that it applies to others and not ourselves. So we tend to perceive other people's behavior based on their personality, but not our own behavior, right? Why is that? We have more information about ourselves. And then our figure or figure-ground relations, a figure stands out. We are in the background. Okay, that seems like it doesn't make sense, but it does. So others are, when you're watching somebody doing something, some action in a store, you're watching them. They are the figure, and so you are going to attribute their behavior to them personally. Whereas when we're perceiving our own behavior and let's say that we're driving down the road and, I don't know, accidentally cut somebody off. We have a situation. We're late for work. I'm trying to get to my mom's and drop her off some lunch before I can get back here and do this video. there's so many situational factors to it which I can mentally explain to myself, right? Therefore, I'm not applying the error to myself, cutting that person off, if that makes sense. And lastly, is this fundamental attribution error, is it inevitable? Perhaps at first, but what researchers have found is that with time to reflect, the error is reduced. So people make these instant judgments, but when they're given a few minutes to think about the attributions that they're making, they can see this, and then the error is reduced. Another example of fundamental attribution error is Spock, actor Leonard Nimoy. Many people think that because of his character on television, that he also is that way, right? Although perhaps using Spock is dating this a little bit. You can think of any actor at all. I'll date myself by saying someone myself. Even Jennifer Aniston, say you get her character from Friends and you assume that that's what she's like, ignoring the situational factor that she's an actor, and that's the role that she's playing. And in real life, she could be anything, right? Okay. Another attributional bias is the self-serving bias, where we tend to attribute more personal attributions for success and more situational attributions for failures. For example, people in sports do this all the time, right? So when you win the game, you win the game, you had a fantastic game, everybody played really well, a lot of passing, a lot of good touches, all of these personal reasons for why you won the game. Now, of course, when you lose a game, that's when you start yelling things like, the ref made a bunch of bad calls, they called that offside, all sorts of reasons for why they lost the game. One thing about self-serving bias is that it's also different from culture to culture, and also the strength of self-serving bias, it depends on psychological states. For example, depressed people often tend to make more personal attributions for failures. And then from culture to culture, more conservative cultures tend to not make more personal attributions for success, and would perhaps do more of a situational or group attributions. But it's just important to remember that it does depend on psychological states, such as depression, and then it differs from culture to culture. So diving more deeply into culture and attribution, and talking about the fundamental attribution bias, like to do with whether things are attributed to personal factors or to situational factors. So we're looking at the differences between cultures. So individualistic cultures, such as Western cultures, they tend to give more personal attributions, right? Where collectivist cultures, like East Asian cultures, whatnot, they're more modest and take more personal responsibility for their failures. East Asian cultures are more complex and they take more holistic views of behavioral causes. So on the Western side, they're saying a success is attributed, like I'm going to attribute the success to myself because we're more individualistic, whereas in East Asian societies, because they take more complex holistic views, a success, I'm not going to attribute it just to my own personal attribution. It's not just me. There's many reasons why I did well on that. So if we look at a study here that they were looking at personal attribution and situational attributions between American participants and Indian participants. Now there's not a lot of detail about the situations that they are presenting to these participants, but the point is that you can see on the left here, across age 8, 11, 15, and adult, American participants tended to attribute personal attributions significantly higher in different situations than did Indian participants. Where on the right side, given X amount of situations and asked whether it was a personal or situational attribution, whether the reason for the behavior was personal or whether it could be attributed to situational factors. Indian participants tended to say situational factors, whereas American participants downplayed the situational because they tend to attribute to personal. Forming and maintaining impressions. So here we're talking about primacy effects and recency effects. Okay, so the question is, it's about first impressions, and we hear a lot about first impressions being the most important. Okay, so why is that? So one reason first impression goes along with the primacy effect. Primacy effect is our tendency to attach more importance to initial information. So imagine when you meet someone for the first time. Okay, it's brand new, the person just shows up, bam. You're going to attach more importance to the initial information, right? Did they smile? Did they come across as friendly? What did you think of them, right? How are they dressed? Maybe, I don't know. Whatever your impression may be. So the primacy effect is that we attach more information to this. Why is that? We tend to be most alert to information when we receive it first. And then on top of that, that initial information that you get can shape how you perceive subsequent information. So when you meet the person and you get a really positive feeling from them, that positive feeling and that initial information is going to shape the information that you receive over the course of the next 5 or 10 minutes that you're speaking with that person, right? Recency effect. Recency's effect is kind of opposite. Okay, so recency effect. So if we are having a class and the class is 3 hours long, recency effect would be you giving greater weight to the most recent information. So for the first 3 hours, that's a little long. Anyways, at first you might have a primacy effect and remember everything that was said at the first, but after a while that kind of fades out, right? As time goes on. And then maybe class ends, and as you leave, you remember the last 15, 20 minutes of the class. That's a recency effect. Recency effect may increase when avoid making snap judgments, reminded to consider information carefully, and you feel accountable for results. Okay, so if you want someone to remember the last, you want them to remember the last part of your speech, you want them to remember the last part of your presentation, you need to remind them to consider the information closer to the end. Also, if I were to say, at the end of this, we're at 18 minutes now. If I were to say, at the end of this 25-minute video, there's going to be a test where you're going to be assessed and get marked on it, you may start remembering the last 5 minutes. You may have increased recency effect because you're accountable for what happens in the last 5 minutes. Next, we have mental sets and schemas, seeing what we expect to see. Okay. So what is a mental set? A mental set is a readiness to perceive the world in a particular way, and these are developed throughout your experiences and throughout time, growing up, whatnot. You have this mental set. You also have schemas, which are mental frameworks that organize and interpret information. So when you come across something new, some environmental stimulus, a new person, whatnot, you sort of have this mental framework that's going to help you interpret that experience in a certain way. And part of that is a stereotype. Stereotype is really a schema. It's a mental framework that you have, a generalized belief about a group or a category. It's a very, very powerful type of schema, and a lot of the time it's unconscious, right? It was built over time, and this schema just sort of exists in your head. So how do these mental sets and schemas and whatnot, how do they create these self-fulfilling prophecies? How do we sort of create what we expect to see? So this is done without conscious awareness, and I think everybody can pretty much relate to this, right? So in the book, you show up at a party and your friend says, "Hey, George over there, he's not very friendly at all. So you may want to just stay away from George." So eventually you kind of wander over and you're like, "Hey, George, how's it going?" And George is very unfriendly. It doesn't say anything, doesn't really respond, just kind of looks at you, and you're like, "Yeah, okay." So you walk away and you're like, "Wow, he is unfriendly. George is a jerk." But if you were to walk into the party and somebody was to say, "Hey, George is over there, he's actually he's a nice guy. He's just super shy, and he's not really good at getting a conversation started. But if you talk to him first, he's a nice guy." So same thing happens. You go over there, you say hi to George. George doesn't really respond. So you make a joke, kind of make George laugh, and then he starts talking, and you get a different outcome. So that's what they're talking about, mental sets and schemas, how your expectation of others sort of determines how you behave towards them as well. And it also can confirm, because you're going to get that response from that person. Sorry. Okay, so we're going to stop here. In the next video, I didn't get completely through part 1, but it's getting a little bit long, so I'm going to chop it up. In the next video, we're going to be looking at the third part, which is attitudes and attitude change. So I will see you there.